July 1944. Deep inside the forests of East Prussia. Rain falls steadily onto concrete roofs, hidden beneath tall pine trees. Thick blast doors stand twisted open. Steel rails disappear into darkness. Inside the bunkers, the air smells of damp concrete, cordite, and burned insulation. Papers lie scattered across the floor. Telephone cables hang loose from shattered walls. In one room, the ceiling has collapsed inward, leaving a crater of broken reinforced concrete nearly 2 meters deep. Silence dominates the complex, broken only by wind moving through the trees. Whatever happened here was violent, deliberate, and unfinished. This place was not abandoned by accident. By the summer of 1944, the Second World War had turned decisively against Germany. In the east, the Red Army was advancing westward at unprecedented speed following Operation Progression. Entire German army groups were being destroyed. In the west, Allied forces had landed in Normandy and were pushing inland. German air superiority no longer existed. Allied bombing had devastated cities, rail networks, and industrial centers. Adolf Hitler, increasingly distrustful and isolated, spent most of the war's final years operating from fortified headquarters far from Berlin. One of these locations had become the nerve center of the German war effort. Hidden in a remote forest near the town of Rastenburg, this complex was known as the Four-Hauptquartier Wolfsschanze, the Wolf's Lair. From June 1941 onward, it served as Hitler's primary command post during the invasion of the Soviet Union and remained one of his most frequently used headquarters until late 1944. It was here that major military decisions were made, orders signed, and armies directed across thousands of kilometers of front line. The Wolf's Lair was not a single bunker. It was a fortified zone covering approximately 6.5 square kilometers of dense woodland. Construction began in late 1940, under strict secrecy. The site was chosen for its isolation, proximity to the Eastern Front, and existing rail connections. At its peak, the complex consisted of around 80 reinforced concrete structures, including massive command bunkers, barracks, power stations, air defense positions, and support facilities. 3 concentric security zones surrounded the core area. The innermost zone was reserved for Hitler and his closest staff. Entry required multiple layers of clearance, armed guards, and identity checks. The scale of construction was extraordinary. Some bunkers had walls over 2.5 meters thick and roofs exceeding 3 meters of reinforced concrete. Later additions increased roof thickness to nearly 8 meters on certain structures to counter heavier Allied bombs. Approximately 20,000 tons of concrete and 5,000 tons of steel reinforcement were used. Camouflage was extensive. Buildings were disguised as simple huts from the air, with artificial trees placed on roofs and nets draped across clearings. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the complex, while nearby airfields allowed rapid movement of personnel. At any given time, the Wolf's Lair housed between 2,000 and 2,500 people. These included military officers, SS guards, communications personnel, engineers, clerks, cooks, drivers, and medical staff. Hitler himself spent more than 800 days at the site between 1941 and 1944. Daily life followed a rigid schedule. Situation briefings, map reviews, and conferences were held in secure rooms, often late into the night. Despite the massive fortifications, the atmosphere was tense. As the war situation worsened, discussions grew more strained, and Hitler's refusal to retreat or compromise increasingly dominated decision-making. On the 20th of July 1944, the Wolf's Lair became the site of one of the most significant internal acts of resistance against the Nazi regime. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg brought a briefcase containing an explosive device into a conference meeting. The bomb detonated at 12:42 p.m., killing 4 people and injuring several others. Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries. The blast severely damaged the conference hut, blowing out walls and collapsing parts of the structure. In the immediate aftermath, security was tightened even further. Concrete bunkers were reinforced again, and meetings were moved deeper underground. Despite these efforts, the strategic value of the Wolf's Lair was rapidly declining. By late 1944, Soviet forces were approaching East Prussia. Artillery could be heard in the distance. Rail lines supplying the complex were under constant threat. Fuel shortages, limited air transport. Maintaining such a large fixed headquarters so close to the front had become untenable. On the 20th of November 1944, Hitler left the Wolf's Lair for the final time, traveling to Berlin and later to the Vorbunker. After Hitler's departure, the site was partially decommissioned but not abandoned immediately. German forces continued to use some facilities while preparing defensive positions in East Prussia. As Soviet troops advanced in January 1945, orders were issued to deny the complex to the enemy. Between the 24th and the 25th of January 1945, German engineers initiated a systematic demolition. Explosive charges were placed throughout the bunkers, targeting structural supports in key rooms. The detonations were massive. Entire sections of reinforced concrete were lifted and shifted. Some bunkers were split open, their roofs displaced by several meters. However, the sheer thickness of the structures meant complete destruction was impossible with the available explosives. When Soviet forces arrived shortly afterward, they found a heavily damaged but still imposing complex. Many bunkers remained largely intact, though rendered unusable. Soviet engineers conducted preliminary inspections, documenting construction methods and defensive layouts. However, the Wolf's Lair held limited practical value for the Red Army. Fixed headquarters of this type were already considered obsolete in the face of modern air power and mobile warfare. The site was stripped of any remaining equipment, wiring, and usable materials. Over time, it was largely abandoned. In the immediate post-war years, the surrounding region underwent major political changes. East Prussia was dissolved, and the area containing the Wolf's Lair became part of Poland. The complex, now located near the town of Kittersee, remained in a state of ruin. Large portions of the forest were mined during the war, and unexploded ordnance posed a significant danger. Polish military engineers spent years clearing mines and securing the area. Records indicate that thousands of mines were removed, but complete clearance was difficult due to the terrain and scale of contamination. During the late 1940s and 1950s, there were discussions about demolishing the remaining bunkers entirely. This proved impractical. Cost and effort required to remove such massive reinforced concrete structures were prohibitive. Instead, the site was left largely as it was. Some bunkers were partially dismantled for scrap metal. Others were left untouched, slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. Trees grew through cracked concrete. Moss covered collapsed roofs. The forest began to absorb the ruins. Western Allied investigators also studied documentation related to the Wolf's Lair through captured German records and post-war interrogations. The site was frequently cited in analyses of German command failures. Reports emphasized how the physical isolation of Hitler and his reliance on static headquarters contributed to rigid decision-making. The Wolf's Lair symbolized a leadership style increasingly disconnected from battlefield realities. The heavy fortifications, once seen as a strength, had ultimately trapped decision-makers in a narrow and distorted view of the war. By the Cold War period, the Wolf's Lair had become a historical site rather than a military one. It was neither preserved as a monument nor erased from the landscape. Instead, it existed in an ambiguous state, a mixture of ruin and forest. In the late 20th century, controlled public access was gradually introduced. Paths were cleared, informational signs installed, and safety measures implemented. Visitors could walk among the shattered bunkers and see firsthand the scale of construction and destruction. Today, historians view the Wolf's Lair as more than just a headquarters. It represents the evolution and limitations of centralized command in modern warfare. The complex was designed to protect leadership from physical threats, but it could not protect against strategic misjudgment. Its destruction was not the result of enemy assault but of deliberate abandonment by the regime that built it. The massive investment of resources, labor, and material yielded no decisive advantage in the final stages of the war. In strategic terms, the Wolf's Lair demonstrated the diminishing returns of static fortification in an era dominated by air power, mobility, and intelligence warfare. Its existence influenced post-war military planning, reinforcing the shift toward mobile command structures and dispersed decision-making centers. No major power would again invest in such a fixed, singular command complex on that scale. As the forest continues to grow around the ruins, the Wolf's Lair remains frozen in a moment of collapse. Broken concrete, exposed rebar, and empty rooms mark the place where critical decisions once shaped the fate of millions. The silence that fills the bunkers today contrasts sharply with the urgency and tension that once defined them. What remains is not a monument to strength, but a record of desperation, isolation, and the limits of power when strategy fails. In the end, the Wolf's Lair did not fall to bombs or infantry assaults. It was dismantled by retreat, abandoned by defeat, and left behind as history moved on.